Dr. Malcolm Lewis arrived home just as the sun began to rise, his mind fogged with exhaustion after another demanding night shift. Pulling into the driveway of his well-kept suburban home, he noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The porch light flickered slightly, the early morning stillness wrapping around the house like a comforting blanket. It was the kind of neighborhood where things rarely went wrong, and routines were rarely disrupted. Stepping inside, he placed his keys on the kitchen counter and glanced around. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Jessica, his wife, should have been asleep upstairs, but something felt off. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the counter from the night before, and the sliding glass door to the backyard was slightly ajar. A breeze drifted in, stirring the curtains. A strange sense of unease settled in his chest as he stepped onto the patio. The pool water shimmered under the soft light of dawn, but something about it made him pause. Floating near the edge was Jessica, face down, completely still. His breath caught in his throat, but he didn't shout. He didn't rush. Instead, he moved closer, the cold dread creeping in with every step. His movements were deliberate as he knelt beside the pool and dialed 911. His voice, eerily composed, relayed the facts without emotion. "My wife, she's in the pool. She's not moving." The dispatcher's voice instructed him to begin CPR, but his hands hovered uncertainly over her body before finally pulling her onto the deck. He pressed down on her chest with mechanical precision, his face void of panic. When emergency responders arrived, Malcolm stepped back without protest, watching as they took over. Paramedics moved quickly, but within minutes, it was clear that Jessica was beyond saving. An officer pulled Malcolm aside, asking him routine questions. His answers were clear, straightforward. Where he had been, what time he arrived, whether Jessica had any health issues. Everything about him seemed too precise, too practiced. Detectives arrived soon after, their eyes scanning the scene with methodical scrutiny. The pool area was pristine, untouched except for a single overturned deck chair. No signs of forced entry, no scuffle, no broken glass. Just Jessica, lying there as if she had slipped quietly beneath the water without a fight. It seemed, at first glance, like a tragic accident. Neighbors slowly trickled out of their homes, standing in clusters at the edge of their driveways. Whispers carried through the air. Jessica had always been friendly, the kind of woman who waved to passers-by and organized neighborhood gatherings. The perfect wife, at least from the outside looking in. But even perfect lives had cracks. Some recalled recent tension between the couple, subtle changes that didn't go unnoticed. Jessica staying out late, Malcolm's increasingly distant demeanor, their once lively home growing quieter over the months. No one wanted to speculate openly, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Something wasn't right. Inside the house, officers combed through the rooms, looking for anything out of place. Jessica's phone was still on the nightstand, her purse untouched, her jewelry neatly arranged as if she had been preparing for bed. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anything had been taken. It was the picture of an ordinary night, until it wasn't. The lead detective, a seasoned investigator with years of experience reading people, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Malcolm's demeanor was calm, almost unnervingly so. He stood on the patio, arms crossed, watching the officers move through the house with a distant expression. He answered questions when asked, but there was no sense of urgency in his voice. When asked why Jessica might have been out by the pool so late, he hesitated just enough to be noticeable. "I don't know," he said finally. "She liked the water." A vague answer, delivered without emotion. The detective made a mental note. The preliminary examination of Jessica's body revealed nothing obvious. No external injuries beyond minor bruising on her wrists, which could have been caused by anything. But something about the way she was found, floating so still and perfectly positioned, made the investigators uneasy. Accidents rarely looked this clean. As the hours passed, neighbors continued to speculate. Some whispered about how Jessica had confided in a friend recently, mentioning trouble in her marriage. Others remembered seeing her speaking quietly with the contractor working on their home, their conversations lingering a little too long. It was innocent, they thought, until now. Malcolm was brought in for formal questioning later that morning. His alibi was solid. Security footage from the hospital confirmed he had been there throughout the night. Colleagues vouched for him, saying he had been focused on his work, showing no signs of distress. But the detectives couldn't ignore the lingering doubts. A man's alibi could be airtight, but his behavior told another story. Sitting in the interview room, Malcolm remained composed, offering logical explanations for every detail. He spoke about Jessica fondly but without emotion, his words carefully chosen. He expressed sorrow but didn't shed a tear. When pressed about their relationship, he admitted they had been going through a rough patch but insisted they were working things out. The detectives weren't convinced. They had seen it before. Grief didn't always present itself in tears and breakdowns, but Malcolm's calculated responses felt rehearsed. His lack of visible anguish stood out, feeding the growing suspicion that maybe this wasn't just an accident. As the crime scene investigators continued their work, they collected what little evidence they could: Jessica's phone, the security footage from nearby houses, and Malcolm's own clothing for analysis. No blood, no struggle, just an eerie sense that things didn't add up. By midday, the forensic team removed Jessica's body from the scene, leaving behind a house filled with quiet tension. Malcolm stood on the patio, watching them leave with a blank expression, hands in his pockets. The questions lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. Could he have done this? To the outside world, he was a respected doctor, a man dedicated to saving lives. But beneath the surface, there were whispers of a man stretched too thin, a marriage cracking under pressure, and now, an accident that didn't quite fit. The investigation into Jessica Lewis's death began with quiet efficiency. The crime scene had been processed, the body sent for autopsy, and now detectives turned their attention to the person at the center of it all: Malcolm Lewis. His alibi was solid. Security footage from the hospital showed him arriving for his shift at 7 p.m. and leaving at 6:15 a.m., barely 15 minutes before the 911 call. Multiple colleagues confirmed his presence throughout the night. On paper, he couldn't have been involved, but something about him didn't sit right. Detective Samantha Collins, leading the case, studied him closely during their first formal interview. Sitting across the table in the sterile interview room, Malcolm maintained a composed demeanor. His hands rested neatly on the table, his eyes focused but distant. When asked to recount his discovery of Jessica, he spoke with clinical precision. No unnecessary details, no visible grief. "She liked to swim at night sometimes," he said. "I don't know why she was out there so early." The response felt empty, detached. Collins made a note of it. "And your relationship recently? Any issues?" Malcolm hesitated for a brief moment, the only flicker of emotion cracking through his otherwise calm exterior. "We've been going through a rough patch, but we were trying to work things out." It was the kind of answer detectives expected: vague, neutral, neither an admission nor a denial. While Malcolm was being questioned, investigators combed through the couple's life. Friends and neighbors were interviewed, and the responses were a mix of concern and quiet gossip. Most described the couple as distant in recent months, with Jessica seen more frequently outside the house, sometimes leaving late at night. A few neighbors mentioned overhearing tense conversations, though nothing overtly alarming. Then came the first real sign that Jessica's death might not have been an accident. One neighbor reported hearing an argument the night before her death. "I didn't think much of it," she said. "Couples fight, but it sounded bad." The statement wasn't enough to incriminate Malcolm, but it added fuel to the growing suspicion. Further scrutiny came when detectives reviewed Malcolm's phone records. A call had been made to Jessica's number at 3:47 a.m., the approximate time of death, but Malcolm denied making it. He claimed he had left his phone in his office while attending to patients. Detectives weren't convinced. They requested a deeper forensic analysis of the phone's GPS data, hoping to pinpoint its exact location during that time. In the meantime, Jessica's autopsy results revealed a troubling detail. While drowning was listed as the official cause of death, minor bruising was discovered on her wrists. The medical examiner suggested they could have been caused by restraint or an attempt to pull herself up. It was enough to warrant further investigation. As the police expanded their inquiries, more cracks in Malcolm's perfect image began to show. Jessica's sister, Laura, provided a different perspective on their relationship. "She was unhappy," Laura told detectives. "Jessica said Malcolm was becoming distant, cold. She even stayed with me for a few days last month. When asked if Jessica ever expressed fear, Laura hesitated. Not directly, but I could tell something wasn't right. Jessica's finances revealed another interesting find. Just weeks before her death, she had taken out a significant life insurance policy, naming Malcolm as the sole beneficiary. While it wasn't unusual for a married couple to have such arrangements, the timing raised eyebrows. The policy had been approved just 10 days before her death. Detectives brought Malcolm in for further questioning. This time, they pressed harder. Did Jessica ever talk about feeling unsafe? Collins asked. Malcolm's expression remained blank. No, never. Did you take out any new insurance policies recently? No, Malcolm said, but his response was too quick, too rehearsed. While they couldn't yet prove anything, the growing inconsistencies in his responses made detectives consider the possibility that his solid alibi might not be enough to clear him completely. As news of Jessica's death spread through their social circles, whispers about another possible angle surfaced. Jessica had been seen spending time with their home contractor, Ryan Callahan. Friends mentioned they had grown close, perhaps too close. Some recalled seeing them talking in the driveway late at night, while Malcolm was at work. When confronted, Malcolm dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. Ryan's just the contractor. Jessica handled everything with the renovations. But Ryan's wife, Alyson, told a different story. When detectives interviewed her, her discomfort was palpable. She admitted she had confronted Jessica once after suspecting something was going on. She brushed it off, Alyson said. Told me I was overthinking it. Malcolm was called in again, and this time detectives asked directly, "Did you know about Jessica's relationship with Ryan?" His jaw tightened. His posture stiffened. "No," he said flatly, but doubt lingered. At the same time, forensic teams discovered something else, a smudge of mud on the pool deck, near where Jessica had been found. It didn't match the surrounding area, suggesting someone might have been there recently, someone who shouldn't have been. As detectives pieced together the evidence, Malcolm remained their prime suspect. His alibi was solid, but his behavior, his financial gain from Jessica's death, and the underlying tension in their marriage made him the perfect person to have a motive. The community's perception of Malcolm began to shift as well. The once-admired doctor was now the subject of quiet speculation. Some neighbors spoke about how he often worked late, leaving Jessica alone for long stretches of time. Others mentioned how detached he had been at neighborhood events, always on his phone, always distant. By the end of the week, detectives believed they had enough to bring the case to the next level. They requested a search warrant for Malcolm's home, looking for anything that might connect him further to the crime. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time, Malcolm seemed to feel it. At the same time, a nagging thought persisted in Detective Collins' mind. If Malcolm really did have an airtight alibi, how could he have possibly done it? They were about to find out. As investigators dug deeper into Jessica Lewis's life, a new angle began to take shape, one that shifted the case from a tragic accident to something far more complex. Quiet conversations with neighbors and friends painted a picture of a woman who had been unhappy in her marriage for some time. She was seen more frequently outside the home, often deep in conversation with Ryan Callahan, the contractor working on the Lewis home renovations. Ryan, a well-known figure in the neighborhood, had been hired months earlier to remodel the couple's kitchen and patio. The project was supposed to take a few weeks, but it had stretched into months, with Ryan becoming a familiar presence around the house. Jessica had taken a keen interest in the renovations, often spending long hours discussing details with him while Malcolm was at work. At first, it seemed innocent, but over time, neighbors began to notice lingering glances, hushed conversations, and Jessica's increasingly distracted demeanor. It didn't take long for detectives to confirm what many had quietly suspected. Jessica and Ryan had been having an affair. Digital forensic specialists recovered fragments of deleted text messages from Jessica's phone, conversations that hinted at more than just a professional relationship. Phrases like, "I can't stop thinking about you," and "we need to figure this out before it's too late," stood out. The texts had been wiped clean, but not thoroughly enough to escape the scrutiny of law enforcement. When confronted, Ryan Callahan admitted to the affair without hesitation. He described their relationship as an emotional escape for both of them. Jessica, feeling neglected in her marriage, and Ryan, trapped in a strained relationship with his own wife, Alyson. According to Ryan, they had never intended for things to escalate the way they did. They had talked about ending it, but emotions were difficult to untangle. He insisted that Jessica had been ready to tell Malcolm and move forward with her life, but they were taking it one step at a time. Malcolm Lewis, however, denied any knowledge of the affair. He maintained that their marriage had its ups and downs like any other, but he had no reason to suspect Jessica was unfaithful. Detectives found his reaction unconvincing. The deleted messages on Jessica's phone told a different story. Texts she had sent to an unknown number, expressing concern that Malcolm was starting to ask questions. It suggested that, despite his denial, Malcolm had at least some awareness that something was amiss. The revelation of the affair shifted the entire investigation's focus. Suddenly, Malcolm had a clear motive. The affair added a layer of emotional turmoil that investigators couldn't ignore. A betrayed husband, a struggling marriage, and now a tragic death. It fit the textbook pattern of a crime fueled by jealousy and revenge. Alyson Callahan, Ryan's wife, became a crucial piece in the unfolding puzzle. During interviews, she provided valuable insight into the affair's dynamics. She had known something was wrong for months, suspecting Ryan was involved with Jessica but unable to prove it. She recalled how Jessica and Ryan had been growing too close during the renovation process, spending more time together than necessary. Alyson noted that Jessica seemed almost relieved when Malcolm wasn't around, and Malcolm himself had started pulling away from social events, seeming more distant and distracted than usual. According to Alyson, the changes in Malcolm were subtle but telling. His absence at neighborhood gatherings became more frequent, and his interactions with Jessica grew colder. She remembered a specific evening when Jessica had arrived home late from a supposed shopping trip, and Malcolm's expression when he greeted her had been one of quiet suspicion. Investigators began piecing together a timeline that raised even more questions. Surveillance footage from local businesses showed Jessica and Ryan meeting at a nearby cafe weeks before her death, sitting close and engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Witnesses recalled seeing Malcolm driving by the cafe that evening, though he never confronted them. Friends of Jessica came forward with their own observations. One of her closest friends mentioned that Jessica had confided in her just days before the incident. She had expressed guilt about the affair but also hinted that Malcolm was behaving strangely, asking pointed questions and making comments that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. While all of this painted Malcolm in an increasingly suspicious light, there was still the undeniable fact of his solid alibi. Investigators were torn. If Malcolm had known about the affair, he had every reason to want Jessica out of his life. But could he have found a way to orchestrate it while working a documented shift at the hospital? Detectives revisited the physical evidence from the scene. Jessica's bruises, initially brushed off as incidental, were re-examined with fresh eyes. Could they have been from an altercation earlier in the day, rather than from a struggle in the water? The timeline became murky. Meanwhile, Ryan Callahan's story remained consistent. He insisted that their relationship was over and that he had been at home with Alyson on the night of Jessica's death. His phone records back this up, showing no communication between him and Jessica in the hours leading up to her death. But Alyson's unease during questioning suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of his innocence. The focus on Malcolm intensified, but detectives were careful not to overlook other possibilities. While the affair provided motive, it didn't yet provide means. They began to explore whether someone else, perhaps someone close to Jessica or Ryan, had a reason to intervene in their relationship. Alyson Callahan, despite presenting herself as the wronged wife, had her own motives. She had the opportunity, access to the home, and an emotional stake in Jessica's downfall. Detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that Jessica's death was an impulsive act driven by jealousy and betrayal. As the case unfolded, the community's perception of Malcolm shifted even further. He went from being a grieving husband to a man under intense scrutiny. Neighbors who once expressed sympathy now whispered about his cold demeanor and the signs they might have missed. The weight of public suspicion pressed down on him, and even those closest to him began to doubt his innocence. Despite Malcolm's insistence that he had no idea about Jessica's affair, the evidence suggested otherwise. The deleted texts, the changes in his behavior, and the strained interactions leading up to Jessica's death all pointed to a man who was either in deep denial or carefully hiding something. For the detectives, the affair was no longer just a piece of gossip. It was the missing link that could explain why Jessica was dead. And until they could rule Malcolm out completely, he remained their primary suspect. As the investigation continued, pieces of evidence began to surface, pieces that painted Malcolm Lewis in an increasingly suspicious light. While his alibi at the hospital seemed airtight, the detectives couldn't ignore the inconsistencies piling up. What started as a tragic accident was now shaping into something far more sinister, and the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the picture became. The first major crack in Malcolm's story came from a neighbor's security camera footage. Initially, Malcolm had told investigators that he arrived home around 6:30 a.m., only minutes before calling 911. However, the footage told a different story. At approximately 5:50 a.m., an unfamiliar figure was seen near the backyard, someone wearing dark clothing, eerily similar to what Malcolm had been seen in earlier. The figure moved toward the pool area, disappearing from view for several minutes before re-entering the house. The timestamp left little room for doubt. When confronted with the discrepancy, Malcolm's explanation was brief. He insisted it must have been an error or a case of mistaken identity, but his calm, detached demeanor only deepened the investigators' doubts. If he had nothing to hide, why did his timeline fail to add up? Jessica's phone records provided the next red flag. A missed call from Malcolm's number had been logged at 3:47 a.m., the estimated time of death based on the coroner's findings. Malcolm, however, denied making the call, claiming his phone had been left in his hospital office during his shift. The investigators weren't convinced. Calls could be made remotely, and it raised questions about whether Malcolm had used an opportunity during a break to check in on Jessica, or worse, orchestrate something from a distance. Detectives obtained search warrants for the couple's electronic devices, hoping to find more clarity. A forensic sweep of their shared laptop uncovered a series of concerning internet searches. Phrases such as drowning accidents, how long does it take to die underwater, and best ways to make it look like an accident appeared in the search history, scattered across several weeks leading up to Jessica's death. The searches were done at odd hours, often when Malcolm was home alone. When questioned about the searches, Malcolm was quick to dismiss them, suggesting Jessica may have been looking up such things for reasons he didn't understand. Investigators knew that self-harm couldn't be ruled out entirely, but the search patterns seemed calculated, methodical, less like curiosity and more like research. Adding to their growing list of concerns were the faint scratches observed on Malcolm's forearms. Initially dismissed as incidental injuries from his demanding work in the emergency room, forensic experts took a closer look. The pattern of the scratches was inconsistent with typical workplace accidents. Instead, they resembled defensive wounds, the kind seen when someone tries to fend off an attacker. Malcolm insisted they were from handling equipment at the hospital, but detectives weren't buying it. Colleagues at the hospital were discreetly interviewed, and none recalled seeing any visible injuries on Malcolm in the days leading up to Jessica's death. The media soon caught wind of the investigation, and Malcolm's name became a headline fixture overnight. News reports framed him as the grieving husband whose story didn't quite add up, with speculation running rampant about his potential involvement. Journalists parked outside his home, and headlines dissected every detail of the couple's troubled marriage and the affair that had come to light. Under the glare of public scrutiny, Malcolm's behavior became even more reserved. He stopped attending memorial events for Jessica, and friends who once supported him now maintained a cautious distance. The court of public opinion had already made its decision. Malcolm was guilty in their eyes. Meanwhile, the detectives worked to solidify their case. Jessica's financial records, reviewed once more, suggested something even more troubling. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had made several large withdrawals, amounts just small enough to avoid raising immediate suspicion. Investigators speculated she may have been planning to leave Malcolm, and if he had discovered this, it could have been the breaking point. A forensic examination of Jessica's car revealed further troubling details. A set of Malcolm's fingerprints were found on the trunk handle, an unusual place given that he rarely drove her vehicle. Had he confronted her there before she made it inside that night? Or worse, had she tried to leave, only to be stopped? Despite mounting evidence, Malcolm remained steadfast in his innocence. His attorney, now a constant presence, framed the investigation as a witch hunt, pointing out the lack of direct proof tying Malcolm to the scene at the time of death. Detectives, however, weren't deterred. They brought in Ryan Callahan again, hoping to pressure him into revealing anything else he might know. Ryan stuck to his original story but admitted something new. Jessica had told him she felt watched, that Malcolm had been questioning her whereabouts more frequently in the days leading up to her death. This revelation pushed the detectives to dig even deeper into Malcolm's actions leading up to Jessica's final days. Surveillance footage from a local gas station placed him just blocks from their home on nights when he claimed to have been at the hospital. Though not enough to accuse him outright, it added another layer of deception to an already complicated case. Throughout the process, Malcolm maintained his calm facade. But to those observing closely, there were moments when the mask slipped, small cracks in his otherwise polished exterior. A fleeting look of frustration during questioning, a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his leg, or the way he avoided direct eye contact when certain questions arose. The investigation had reached a tipping point. Detectives knew they needed something concrete to make their move, something that would either confirm their suspicions or exonerate Malcolm once and for all. Every shred of evidence pointed toward him, yet the nagging question remained. Could a man with an airtight alibi truly have orchestrated his wife's death? As the pressure mounted, the team decided to conduct one final search of the Lewis home, hoping for a breakthrough. The answers were there, buried beneath the surface. They just had to find them before it was too late. The investigation into Jessica Lewis's death had reached a boiling point. Every piece of evidence seemed to point toward Malcolm, and yet there was something detectives couldn't ignore. Certain gaps that refused to align perfectly. Just as the case against him appeared airtight, an unexpected witness stepped forward, bringing a new dimension to the unfolding mystery. Alyson Callahan, the wife of Ryan Callahan, had been a quiet presence throughout the investigation. She had initially cooperated, answering questions without much emotion, painting herself as the betrayed wife left to pick up the pieces after Jessica's affair with Ryan came to light. But as media attention grew and whispers circulated in the neighborhood, Alyson finally broke her silence. Sitting down with detectives in a follow-up interview, Alyson's demeanor was noticeably different from before. There was tension in the air as she hesitated before speaking. Then, in a quiet, measured voice, she revealed that Jessica had confided in her just days before her death. Jessica had told Alyson that she was planning to tell Malcolm about the affair. She wanted to come clean, to stop living in secrecy, and to figure things out, once and for all. Detectives listened carefully, recognizing the significance of this revelation. If Jessica had been planning to confess, it meant Malcolm could have found out sooner than they originally believed, giving him even more of a motive. But Alyson wasn't finished. Lowering her voice, she admitted to something she had previously withheld. She and Jessica had argued days before her death. The confrontation, according to Alyson, was heated. She had confronted Jessica outside a local cafe, demanding that she stay away from Ryan. Witnesses had even seen them standing close together in the parking lot, their body language tense. Alyson now admitted that her anger had boiled over, warning Jessica that she was playing with fire, and that things wouldn't end well if she continued seeing Ryan. The detectives exchanged a glance. Alyson's confession added a new wrinkle to the case. If emotions had run that high, could Alyson have acted in a fit of rage? Was her confrontation with Jessica more than just words? But Alyson insisted she had nothing to do with Jessica's death. I was angry, she said, but I'd never hurt her. I just wanted her out of our lives. Her voice wavered, a mix of guilt and frustration. Despite her insistence of innocence, her confession placed her firmly on the detective's radar. Around the same time, another piece of unexpected testimony came in. A neighbor, who had previously been reluctant to speak, reported seeing someone leaving the Lewis property late at night a few days before Jessica's death. The figure had been dressed in dark clothing, moving quickly down the driveway and disappearing into the street. The witness couldn't make out any identifying features, but the sighting raised questions. Could this mysterious figure have been Malcolm, checking in on Jessica? Could it have been Ryan, sneaking in for one final conversation? Or was it someone else entirely? Investigators revisited the security footage from nearby homes, but the grainy quality and limited angles provided little clarity. The figure seen by the neighbor remained unidentified, but the mere suggestion of another presence threw a wrench into the timeline detectives had been building. Despite these new leads, Malcolm remained the central figure in the investigation. Every new piece of evidence seemed to orbit around him. The discovery that Jessica was planning to confess the affair meant Malcolm had even more to lose: his marriage, his reputation, and potentially his career. Detectives wondered if that knowledge had pushed him over the edge. At the same time, Alyson Callahan's admission opened a new line of inquiry. Investigators started taking a closer look at her whereabouts on the night of Jessica's death. Her alibi, which had initially been taken at face value, was now under scrutiny. She claimed to have been home all evening, but phone records showed she had driven near the Lewis residence earlier in the evening, something she had failed to mention before. When questioned about it, Alyson shrugged it off, claiming she had been running errands and didn't think it was relevant. But detectives weren't convinced. The argument between her and Jessica had clearly been intense, and now Alyson was proving to be less forthcoming than she initially appeared. Meanwhile, Malcolm's behavior continued to fuel suspicion. He remained composed in public, but inside the walls of the police station, cracks were beginning to show. He had become increasingly evasive in follow-up interviews, deflecting questions about Jessica's state of mind and brushing off inquiries about their financial struggles. Detectives couldn't ignore how convenient it was for him to have an ironclad alibi, yet so many other details of his life seemed to unravel under scrutiny. Despite the new potential suspects, the media continued to focus almost exclusively on Malcolm. Reports speculated on his relationship with Jessica, his possible knowledge of the affair, and whether the pressure of his high-stress career had pushed him to the edge. Malcolm, once a respected doctor in the community, was now the subject of endless speculation, and it was clear the weight of public opinion was beginning to wear on him. With all the new information coming in, detectives began mapping out possible timelines, trying to account for every movement in Jessica's final hours. They now had multiple suspects, each with their own motives and opportunities. Alyson Callahan, whose jealousy and frustration over the affair could have boiled over into something far more dangerous. Ryan Callahan, whose desire to keep his family together might have driven him to desperation. And Malcolm Lewis, the betrayed husband, whose seemingly perfect alibi couldn't explain the inconsistencies in his behavior. As detectives revisited evidence, a troubling pattern emerged. Jessica had been reaching out to several people in the days leading up to her death. A series of calls to an unknown number, later identified as a divorce attorney, suggested she was preparing to take action. This revelation further complicated the investigation. If Malcolm had discovered this, it could have been the final straw. Despite the widening pool of suspects, Malcolm remained at the center of the investigation. The new testimonies only reinforced detectives' belief that he had the most to lose and the most to gain from Jessica's death. But as they prepared to bring him in for another round of questioning, a nagging feeling lingered in the minds of the investigators. If Malcolm was truly guilty, why were there still so many unanswered questions? The investigation into Jessica Lewis's death had been progressing steadily, but detectives were still struggling to find the one crucial piece that would tie everything together. Malcolm Lewis remained the primary suspect, but with an airtight alibi and no direct evidence linking him to the crime, frustration was mounting. It was during a secondary forensic analysis that something unexpected surfaced, something small, yet significant enough to shift the entire focus of the case. A forensic technician, re-examining Jessica's body under improved lighting conditions, noticed faint nail marks on her neck. They were subtle, barely visible at first glance, but the pattern suggested a possible struggle, something that hadn't been considered thoroughly before. More importantly, microscopic traces of red nail polish were found beneath Jessica's fingernails. The discovery raised immediate red flags. Jessica never wore polish, preferring a more natural look, and none of her belongings contained any red shades. It was an anomaly that couldn't be ignored. Detectives revisited their interviews, combing through details in search of anyone connected to Jessica who wore bright red polish. A memory stood out: Alyson Callahan, the wife of the contractor Jessica had been involved with. During one of her previous interviews, Alyson had nervously chewed at her fingernails, revealing chipped red polish. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now, it took on a whole new meaning. Rather than confronting Alyson directly, detectives decided to dig deeper into her alibi. Initially, Alyson had claimed she was at home the entire night of Jessica's death, watching television. But when investigators took a closer look at her phone records, they uncovered something troubling. Her phone had pinged off a tower near the Lewis home around midnight. To further validate their suspicions, detectives checked surveillance footage from nearby stores and traffic cameras. A breakthrough came when grainy footage from a convenience store a few blocks away showed Alyson's car passing by the Lewis house shortly after 12:30 a.m. It wasn't enough for a direct accusation, but it certainly placed her near the scene at a time she claimed to be at home. The discovery of these inconsistencies reignited the investigation. Detectives began quietly piecing together Alyson's movements in the days leading up to Jessica's death. They found out that Alyson had confronted Jessica at least once, outside a local cafe, in what witnesses described as a heated argument. While Alyson had initially downplayed the incident, it was now being viewed in a different light. The case against Malcolm wasn't as airtight as it had once seemed. Despite the incriminating circumstantial evidence against him, the emerging inconsistencies in Alyson's story opened up new avenues. Yet, detectives were careful not to rule him out completely. They knew that assuming too soon could lead them astray, and Malcolm's odd behavior still raised questions that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, the media had begun to shift its narrative. News outlets, initially portraying Malcolm as a heartless husband hiding behind his status as a respected doctor, started hinting at other possibilities. Whispers about Jessica's affair, the Callahans' crumbling marriage, and Alyson's potential jealousy swirled through social media. Friends and neighbors began sharing new observations with the police, perhaps emboldened by the changing tides of public opinion. One neighbor, who had remained silent until now, reported seeing someone leave the Lewis property late at night, only days before the tragedy. The figure had been wearing dark clothing and moved quickly, as if avoiding detection. Though the witness couldn't confirm an identity, the sighting cast further doubt on the original timeline investigators had pieced together. Tensions continued to mount. The discovery of the nail polish traces and the inconsistencies in Alyson's alibi were enough for detectives to widen their scope, but they needed concrete proof. The challenge now was balancing their focus between the two prime suspects, Malcolm and Alyson, without overlooking any crucial details. To maintain the pressure, detectives called Alyson back in for further questioning under the pretense of clarifying her previous statements. This time, they observed her carefully. She seemed more tense, her answers more rehearsed. When asked about the chipped nail polish seen during their earlier conversation, she laughed nervously, brushing it off as a habit of hers. Detectives weren't convinced. They watched as she fidgeted, hands trembling slightly, her eyes darting to the door every few minutes. She was feeling the heat, and it was only a matter of time before they uncovered the truth. In the meantime, forensic analysts continued scrutinizing the physical evidence. The scratches found on Malcolm's arms, initially believed to be defensive wounds, were re-examined under this new perspective. Experts suggested that while they could indicate a struggle, they could also be incidental injuries from his work at the hospital. It was yet another piece of evidence that, while suspicious, lacked the definitive connection investigators needed. Detectives pressed forward with their quiet surveillance of Alyson, tracking her movements and monitoring her behavior. It wasn't long before she started showing signs of stress, canceled appointments, sudden changes in her routine, and late-night drives with no clear destination. The focus of the investigation was shifting, but detectives knew they had to be cautious. Public perception was already swinging, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. For now, Malcolm remained in the spotlight, but behind the scenes, the case was taking an entirely new direction, one that would soon reveal the truth in a way no one expected. With tensions rising and the pieces falling into place, investigators were on the verge of a breakthrough. The red nail polish under Jessica's nails was more than just a clue. It was the key to unraveling everything. But before they could act, they needed one final piece to solidify their case. With mounting evidence against Alyson Callahan, investigators believed they had finally cracked the case. The forensic results, the inconsistencies in her alibi, and the surveillance footage placed her near the scene. The red nail polish under Jessica's fingernails seemed like the missing puzzle piece that tied everything together. Alyson was brought in for further questioning, her composure visibly shaken. Detectives presented the evidence methodically: the nail polish, the faint bruises on Jessica's neck, and the timeline that placed her at the Lewis home that night. She denied everything at first, but the pressure was relentless. Eventually, a listen broke. She admitted to confronting Jessica that night, furious over the affair with Ryan. She claimed she only wanted to scare Jessica into ending it, but things escalated. Jessica had pushed her first, and in a moment of blind rage, Alyson retaliated. She said Jessica stumbled, fell into the pool, and didn't resurface. Panicked and terrified, Alyson fled the scene without calling for help. Her confession aligned with much of the evidence investigators had collected, and it seemed like an open and shut case. Alyson was taken into custody, and the media quickly picked up the story, portraying her as a jealous wife driven by emotions. Headlines speculated about a tragic love triangle that had taken a devastating turn, capturing public attention and fueling intense debate. Malcolm Lewis was officially cleared of suspicion. He remained composed through it all, standing before cameras, thanking the police for their dedication and asking for privacy as he mourned his wife. The public bought it. Despite closing the case, something gnawed at the lead detective. Alyson's version of events fit too neatly, and there were gaps that didn't quite add up. The bruising on Jessica's body was more consistent with someone being forcibly held underwater, not an accidental slip. Alyson's slight frame didn't match the force required to sustain such injuries. And then there was the antiseptic. A forensic analyst, going over Jessica's fingernails one last time, noticed traces of a hospital-grade antiseptic under them, something typically used in medical environments. Jessica had no reason to have come into contact with it herself. It was an odd detail, but in a case filled with unanswered questions, it stood out. Investigators revisited Malcolm's work records and found a discrepancy they hadn't noticed before. On the night of Jessica's death, he had taken an unscheduled 30-minute break during his shift, just enough time to drive home and return unnoticed. Surveillance footage from a traffic camera near the Lewis home confirmed it. Malcolm's car had passed by during the crucial time frame, contradicting his previous statements. Detectives quietly re-examined the case. Jessica's phone records, once a minor detail, suddenly gained new significance. The missed call from Malcolm's number at 3:47 a.m. now looked suspicious. Malcolm had claimed his phone was left in his office at the hospital, but further analysis showed that the call had been made from a location closer to his home. It painted a chilling picture, one where Malcolm had used his brief break to return home and confront Jessica. When investigators cross-checked financial records, they found something else alarming. Jessica had been in the process of hiring a divorce attorney and quietly moving funds into a separate account. If she followed through, Malcolm stood to lose a significant portion of their shared assets, something he likely couldn't afford after recent financial struggles. The looming threat of divorce and financial ruin could have pushed him to the breaking point. Despite the mounting doubts, detectives knew they couldn't act without solid evidence. They decided to bring Malcolm in under the pretense of tying up loose ends. Throughout the questioning, he remained calm and cooperative, offering the same rehearsed responses he had given since the start of the investigation. But when confronted with the surveillance footage showing his car near the house, his expression faltered for the first time. Pressed further, Malcolm claimed he had gone home briefly to check on Jessica, but insisted she was fine when he left. Detectives didn't buy it. They methodically laid out the forensic inconsistencies, the antiseptic under Jessica's nails, and the financial motive. Malcolm's usual composure began to crack. As the questioning intensified, Malcolm's demeanor shifted from calm to defensive. He stumbled over his explanations, contradicting himself, and as the detectives pressed harder, his carefully crafted facade collapsed. He finally broke, his voice trembling as he admitted what had really happened that night. He had discovered Jessica's affair weeks earlier but had kept it to himself, monitoring her every move, waiting for the right moment. When he found out she was planning to leave him, it was too much. Fueled by rage and fear of losing everything, he drove home that night under the guise of a work break and confronted her by the pool. They argued, and when she threatened to take half of everything he had worked for, something inside him snapped. He pushed her into the water and held her down until she stopped struggling. After realizing what he had done, Malcolm methodically staged the scene to make it look like an accident. He left Jessica's body floating in the water, cleaned up any signs of struggle, and returned to the hospital before calling 911. Knowing about Alyson's confrontation with Jessica earlier that week, he was confident suspicion would fall on her. He deleted incriminating messages and relied on his reputation to shield him from scrutiny. The confession stunned investigators. For weeks, they had been chasing Alyson, convinced she was the jealous wife who had let her emotions spiral out of control. Malcolm had manipulated them all, using Alyson's anger and their rocky marriage as the perfect cover for his crime. Alyson, now fully cleared of suspicion, was released from custody. Though relieved, she was deeply affected by the events and the unintended role she played in the case. Meanwhile, Malcolm was taken into custody and formally charged, his once respected reputation in ruins. The media, which had initially portrayed him as a grieving husband, now focused on the shocking revelations, depicting him as a man who had carefully hidden the truth behind a facade of innocence. In the aftermath, the community struggled to come to terms with the truth. Many had believed in Malcolm's innocence, convinced that his professional standing and calm demeanor meant he couldn't possibly be capable of such violence. But beneath the surface, his desperation and fear of losing control had driven him to commit the ultimate betrayal. For the detectives, the case served as a sobering reminder that appearances could be deceiving. Even the most solid alibis could crumble under scrutiny, and the most innocent-seeming people could harbor the darkest secrets.